The hills opened before Jacob, like an old dream returned to daylight. Pale gold washed across the ridges, and the air trembled with the hum of insects waking under the sun. He had crossed back into the land of his fathers, yet each step felt as uncertain as the first time he left it. Behind him lay the river that had given him a new name, a wound, and a peace he did not yet understand. Before him stretched soil that had been promised long before his birth, a soil thick with memory and unseen roots of covenant. The camp moved slowly, a living river through the valleys. Children ran ahead chasing shadows, the sound of their feet mingling with the bleating of goats. Women packed tents, brushed dust from jars, and called out to one another in low, familiar tones. Men guided flocks toward pasture, their staffs tapping a rhythm into the ground. Jacob walked at the front, leaning slightly on his staff. The limp from the river had not faded, and he did not wish it to. It reminded him that strength and surrender could share the same body. When they came to the open fields of Shechem, the air smelled of grass and smoke and distant water. He marked the ground and built an altar of stones taken from the hillside, each one lifted by hand, each one laid with care. Oil darkened the surface, running slow between the cracks. He named the place El-Elohe-Israel, the God of Israel. The name carried a weight that felt larger than him, like a mantle he was still learning to wear. For a time, peace lived among them. Days slipped by in a pattern that felt almost ordinary. The laughter of children replaced the echo of fear. Leah sang softly at night. Rachel's voice threaded through the camp like light through thin cloth, and the herd spread wide and fattened. But peace has edges, and they cut easily. One evening the quiet shattered. A wrong done and avenged twisted the land into mourning. By dawn the soil near Shechem was heavy with blood, and the air tasted of iron. The sons of Jacob, fierce and young, had struck for honor, but their vengeance left the family exposed. Rumor moved faster than footsteps. The surrounding cities stirred, and Jacob felt the tremor of danger approaching. He walked among the tents at dusk, the torchlight trembling against his face, and the silence of the camp pressed close around him. That night, the voice came again, not in thunder, but in the quiet certainty that filled the space between breaths. It told him to rise, to leave the valley and go to Bethel, to build there an altar to the God who had appeared when he fled from Esau. The instruction came with mercy folded inside it. Jacob knew what to do. At dawn he gathered his household. The people stood in a wide circle, their faces drawn with fatigue and fear. He told them to bring out the foreign gods that clung to their tents and the trinkets of silver and bone worn for luck. One by one they stepped forward, placing small figures, rings, and charms into his hands. He carried them to a great oak near the camp and buried them beneath its roots. The earth closed over the old loyalties, and the wind through the branches sounded almost like release. The caravan moved out at sunrise. Flocks followed, dust rising in soft clouds around the legs of animals and men. The path wound through ridges where the light shifted from gold to gray and back again. Jacob walked at the head, slow but sure. The limp gave him pace, not limitation. He felt the ache at his side as a reminder that faith costs, but also that it holds. Around him, the world seemed watchful, as if creation itself remembered the promise made to his fathers. They reached Bethel after several days, weary but unbroken. The place looked both familiar and changed, as if it had been waiting. Stones still dotted the ground, where he had once slept with a rock for a pillow. The sky still spread wide, endless and blue, the same sky that had opened years ago to show him a ladder of light. Now he came not as a fugitive, but as a man who carried a nation in his shadow. He built again, stone upon stone, layer by layer, until the altar stood solid and high. He poured oil across its surface and bowed his head, the scent rising like memory. Around him the camp settled, fires flickered, and the hush of evening deepened into a stillness It felt almost holy. The sound of flocks faded. Even the wind seemed to kneel. He remembered the vow he had spoken here long ago, when fear had been his only companion, and he knew that the vow had not expired. Night stretched quiet over the hills. Within one of the smaller tents, an old woman's breathing slowed. Deborah, who had served his mother and carried stories older than his exile, lay surrounded by the dim glow of oil lamps. Her face was calm, lined by years of faithful service. When her last breath came, it was gentle, as though the world simply folded her into its arms. They buried her beneath an oak not far from the altar, and Jacob named the place Allenbacheth, the Oak of Weeping. Beneath its branches he sat for a long time, eyes open to the stars, and felt the weight of generations gather in the stillness. At dawn the voice returned. It came not as sound but as certainty, filling the air around the altar until the space itself seemed to speak. Jacob stood motionless, the oil flask still in his hand. The words were simple, his name twice spoken, then the reminder that he was Israel. Not correction, but seal. The promise that had begun with Abraham flowed again through his line. Nations would rise from his sons. Kings would walk his blood. The land beneath his feet was not just soil. It was inheritance. He built a pillar beside the altar and poured oil and wine across it until the stone gleamed. Sunlight caught its face, and for a moment he felt that heaven itself bowed low enough to see. He understood then that blessing was never meant to be held. It moved like a river, steady and unstoppable, carrying those who dared to step into its current. The camp lingered there for several days. Children played among the stones, women ground grain near the fires, and the sound of song drifted through the morning air. Jacob watched it all with quiet gratitude. The fear that had chased him from one edge of the world to another seemed far away. He knew better than to think peace was permanent, but he also knew it was real while it lasted. When the time came to move again, the people packed with practiced rhythm. The road turned south toward Ephrath, and the air carried the scent of cold rain. Jacob walked beside the caravan, staff in hand, the landscape opening before him like a story still being written. Each step away from Bethel felt like a heartbeat echoing back to the vow he had kept. The road to Ephrath wound through low hills that rose and sank like the rhythm of breath. Clouds thickened above the ridges, and the air turned cool enough that the animal's breath showed pale in the morning. Dust clung to cloaks and lashes. Each mile sounded the same, the soft clatter of hooves, the creak of wood, the murmur of people learning again to live without fear. Rachel rode near the front, her face thin from travel, one hand resting on her stomach. Life grew there, small and secret, another promise within the larger one that shaped them all. Her laughter had quieted in recent days, replaced by long pauses and slow smiles that carried both joy and ache. Jacob watched her often, reading her silence as prayer. He had learned that love, like faith, asks for endurance. They traveled until the light dimmed, then camped where a stand of tamarisk trees broke the wind. Fires were built, and the smell of grain and smoke threaded the air. Jacob stood apart at the edge of the camp, his staff planted in the soil. He looked north toward Bethel, the altar hidden now by distance, but still burning in his mind. He could feel that something waited ahead, something that would ask again for trust. The next day, the first pains came. The caravan halted. Servants rushed to set a tent apart and brought water, cloth, herbs. Rachel's cries rose against the empty hills. The women moved with skill and urgency, their shadows long in the late sun. Jacob stood outside, eyes closed, the sound of his wife's voice cutting through him. He had built altars to mark mercy before. Now he could only wait for it. The child came as the sky darkened. His cry was sharp and living, proof that hope can still be born through sorrow. But Rachel's breathing slowed. Her strength had gone out with the birth. When silence finally settled, It felt like stone pressing against the chest. Jacob entered and saw her still form, the child swaddled beside her. He lifted the boy and named him Benjamin, the son of his right hand, refusing to let grief have the final word. They buried her beside the road, a short walk from Ephrath. Jacob built a pillar over the grave, rough stones stacked by his own hands. The mark stood plain against the open sky. He lingered there after the others had gone, tracing the edges of the stone with his fingers, memorizing the weight of loss. Each gust of wind pulled dust across the mound, but the pillar remained, as steadfast as the love it guarded. When he turned away, the road seemed emptier. Yet even grief found rhythm in the movement of the caravan. The people still needed water, food, direction. Life pressed forward in small, practical acts. The new child's cries joined the sounds of camp and filled the spaces where silence might have taken hold. Weeks passed, the land shifting from hill to plain. The flocks fattened, the herds grew, and the people learned once again to laugh. At dusk, when the fires burned low, Jacob would sit outside his tent, Benjamin sleeping in the crook of his arm, and watch the stars appear one by one. Their light reminded him of the promise spoken to Abraham, that his descendants would be as countless as the sky. When they reached Hebron, the hills softened into green. The air smelled of cedar and earth after rain. Jacob sent messengers ahead and soon learned that his father Isaac was still alive, though old and thin. The reunion was quiet. No grand gestures, no words needed. Two lives that had traveled separate roads simply stood in the same tent once more. The silence between them carried more forgiveness than speech could manage. Jacob remained there, tending his herds and sons, guiding the rhythm of days. He watched Leah manage the camp with calm authority, her strength steady as weathered rope. He saw his sons grow restless, quick to argue, eager to prove themselves. He remembered his own youth, the cunning that had carried him far, but not always well, and he tried to teach them patience. As the seasons turned, Isaac's breath grew lighter. When the old man died, the brothers stood together beside the cave at Machpelah, the same earth that held Abraham and Sarah. They buried their father without rivalry. The ground that once divided them now received them both as sons. Jacob felt no triumph, only the hush that follows a long vow kept. Years folded over each other like fabric. The tents multiplied, the children married, new herds filled the valleys. Jacob's hair silvered fully. The limp in his step deepened, yet he carried it with the ease of something long accepted. He built another altar, not to mark revelation but gratitude, the quiet kind that comes after storms. The smoke rose straight into a sky washed clear of clouds. At times he walked the boundaries of his fields, the staff clicking against stone, the wind tugging at his cloak. He thought of Rachel's grave, of Bethel's altar, of the river that had named him. He felt how the pieces of his life, fear, deceit, love, loss, had all been drawn into one slow current that only God could see from beginning to end. When the sun sank, he sat by the fire with Benjamin at his feet and Joseph nearby, the boy whose dreams carried a light all his own. Jacob would study their faces and know that promise lived now through them. The ache in his hip pulsed like a heartbeat, steady, rhythmic, a reminder that blessing leaves its mark. He had come to understand that faith is not built on the absence of struggle, but on the endurance within it. Every altar he had raised was a memory of being found when he least deserved it. Every scar was proof that mercy chooses to stay. The camp around him quieted as night deepened. Sparks rose into the dark, vanishing into the same sky where Abraham once counted stars. The land lay still, and Jacob felt a peace that did not erase sorrow, but held it gently, as a hand might hold a fragile flame. The years after Isaac's burial unfolded softly. Jacob stayed in Hebron, the tents spreading wide across the hills. Morning after morning, he rose with the light and moved through camp as quietly as wind through grass. His people had become a multitude. The promise once spoken to his fathers now breathed through generations. The land gave itself in rhythm and patience. Wheat stood tall, flocks grazed in calm circles, and water ran clear from the wells. Jacob no longer counted animals or harvests. Abundance, he had learned, was not a number but an open hand. He walked among the fields with his staff, feeling the pull in his hip, the steady reminder of the night that had remade him. It was no longer pain, but memory turned to motion. At times he thought of Bethel and the ladder of light, yet those moments were no longer separate from his days. The God who had once spoken through dreams now lingered in every hour, in the breath between work and rest, in the quiet that followed prayer. Leah's sons led their own herds. Reuben bore the weight of eldest duty. Judah moved with a calm that drew others near, and the younger ones burned bright with restlessness. Joseph, favored and watchful, dreamed of things that sounded too large for a boy. Jacob saw in him the same thread of mystery that had once wound through his own youth. Evenings brought stillness. Fires lit the circle of tents, and children's laughter rose into the dusk. Jacob sat apart on a low stone, staff across his knees, watching faces flicker in firelight. He thought of how he had once fled through darkness with nothing but fear, and how the same God who had met him then now filled his camp with peace. As his strength thinned, his hands slowed, but his mind stayed clear. When the nights grew cold, he watched the stars above the ridges, the same lights his grandfather had counted when the promise began. Sometimes he woke before dawn and walked beyond the tents, dew brushing his sandals, his limp deliberate but sure. Faith, he knew, was not freedom from scars, but the courage to move with them. He listened to his sons' laughter and quarrels, no longer trying to shape their stories. The one who had wrestled him into peace would meet each of them in time. His task was only to bless and to remember. When the end drew close, he felt no fear. The covenant had survived deserts and deceit, loss and distance. It would outlast him too. One evening, as the sun sank red behind the hills, he sat listening to the camp settle. Joseph's voice carried softly through the air. Jacob closed his eyes and let the sound become his final prayer. He thought of Rachel and Leah, of Isaac and Rebekah, of Abraham beneath distant stars. He thought of the ladder and the river and the long road between them. All of it had become one thread, unbroken and bright. Night deepened, fires fading to embers. Jacob lay down, his breathing slow and even. The same God who had called him Israel once at the river now called him home in silence. At dawn, light touched the doorway of his tent. Wind moved through softly, reminding his people that promise does not die with the man who received it. Outside, the flocks stirred, and children woke to another morning under the same sky. Jacob's story lived on in them, in their blood, their prayers, their steps across the land. His life, uneven and full of mercy, had become what God intended from the start, a bridge between promise and fulfillment. The wind moved again through the fields. The stars above kept their silent watch. Under their light, a people grew, and the covenant endured, alive beneath the same unchanging sky.